Says 70.
Good morning, comrades. It is Monday, the 22nd of March, 2021. This is your daily Good Morning Comrade. How is everybody doing today? Had a nice little weekend. Had a nice day off yesterday. Not watching the basketball for the first time in like many years. I don't know. It just doesn't seem to matter to me that much, I guess. There's like the big college basketball tournament where the people who don't get paid to play basketball and make millions of dollars, uh, you know, they do the big tournament to see who's the best unpaid team of players. Other than that, I mean, this weekend I had a really fun weekend. Did a little bit of gardening, like a true boomer. We're putting some plants and some tomatoes and veggies, some bell peppers and stuff, jalapenos in the backyard. So we're gonna be growing some brand new food. I built a couple of raised garden beds in the backyard, and we're filling them up for the first time. So that's kind of cool. Good morning, Jenny20. How are you today? It is very good to see you this morning. How was your weekend? How have you been doing? It is really good to see all the folks that are here. I do have some stories today. I definitely do. But first I wanted to kind of just check in. It's Monday. How we doing? Got my Covfefe. Yum. Delicious. So I guess I could start getting into the stories. Well, the first one I wanted to talk about is something that's well, you remember when Good Morning Counting Amberjacks? What was it, 2.5 million to count the number of amberjack fish? That's worth it in my opinion. You get the vaccination on Saturday. Oh, cool. Yeah, I got my first round last week or last month, and I get my second one on Wednesday. My wife got hers last week, so she said she had some. Well, she felt bad for a couple days after. Felt really drained, really exhausted. I don't think she had a fever, but apparently the second round kind of knocks you on your butt. I had the first round, like I said, a month ago, and the only side effect I really had was it felt like I got like punched in the arm. It wasn't so bad, but from what I understand, the second round's worse. Which one are you getting? The Johnson & Johnson, the Pfizer, or the Moderna? We could actually start with a story on vaccines because it's been on my mind a lot. I'm ready to get everybody vaccinated and get things to be at least kind of to the point where you can see people again. I don't want to say normal because normal wasn't good. It wasn't acceptable, but it's definitely better than this. But I don't think there's ever any going back. But anyway, there's another vaccine that's out there called the AstraZeneca vaccine. It's another one of these giant corporations, like pharmaceutical companies. And I do want to get into some of the privatization of these things in a minute, but let's just talk about specifically AstraZeneca's vaccine. It's apparently 79% effective against symptomatic COVID-19. It says AstraZeneca, so we're talking about how good their vaccine is. Let's look at this clip here.
All illness, 100. AstraZeneca says 79% effective against all illness, 100% effective against severe and hospitalizations. What does this mean, and what might the impact be here in the U.S.?
John, I think this is very good news to have another vaccine that could potentially be authorized and then be added to our arsenal. I actually think that the best news about AstraZeneca is that they found no adverse events or no significant adverse events, including these blood clots that some have raised concerns about in Europe. And so I think this should be really reassuring, including to people around the world, because the AstraZeneca vaccine is seen as the world's vaccine. It's inexpensive, it's easy to store and to transport. And I think, it adds to our potential supply here in the US. The timing, though, is such that by the time AstraZeneca is submitted for authorization and then actually approved for use here, we probably would be into May, in which case we actually have all these other vaccines that probably would be in enough supply. So I don't think this affects us in the US as much as it does worldwide.
So that's actually good. If this is like the cheaper vaccine, and it's going to be more broadly available worldwide, then
Miami Beach declaring a state of emergency.
We're going to get onto that one in a minute. Actually, no, I don't really care about that. I mean, kids are going to be kids. It's not great, but whatever. It's not great for sure. I just don't feel like particularly interested in finger wagging at them. But anyway, and plus, like, the person to blame for that one's the governor. But anyway, they're just doing spring break stuff in California, and they're like having to call in like curfews and things like that. And I don't know. I wouldn't be very interested in doing spring break right now. So anyway, AstraZeneca vaccine's going out. That is good news. Obviously, like, pharmaceutical companies bad. But at the same time, the fact that it's going to be more widely available in more places outside of the U.S. even, because I mean, we know that the COVID doesn't respect any borders, and pretending that like any national policy or any like national mitigation measure is going to solve the problem, much less states, is ridiculous. Now, having distribution plans, and Amberjack says that they lowered theirs standards today to 40 and older today in Indiana, which is good. Still haven't updated the website though. Hopefully you can sign up today. Well, hopefully you can sign up today, and hopefully you can get the vaccine as soon as possible. Yeah. And so Jenny says also, Jenny's girlfriend has been living for 11 months in a hotel. She's a nurse. She'll take anything to get her back home, I bet. Good Lord. I mean, I have a friend who's an organizer of nurse and medical workers in Minnesota, and it's sort of like the Twin Cities area. And she was telling horror stories about like what it was like what the workers were seeing out there, what was going on, and she was just extremely busy. I was just checking on something. Might have a friend joining us on the show a little bit later on, but I'm not sure. She was not feeling well last week, but she might be joining us on the show if she's feeling up to it. So excuse me for a second. So yeah, AstraZeneca vaccine, 79% effective, cheap. It's going to be broadly distributed. But yeah. That's good news. Here's a bad story. That's sort of related to all that. Massachusetts spent 20 years. Hey. Massachusetts spent 20 years refining its own mass vaccination plan, and then it privatized it. This is a headline that's actually changed. This is from March 4th. It's an older story. Um, Massachusetts, nearly 2 decades and millions of dollars planning how it would mobilize its vast network of public health departments to respond to an emergency situation. But just days after federal drug regulators authorized the first COVID-19 vaccine in mid-December, the state abandoned its blueprint and instead entrusted a handful of private companies with running its mass vaccination sites. Womp womp. So essentially, you build up this whole network of vaccines, this public network of vaccines, and then all of a sudden in mid-December, right after the COVID vaccine thing, like the vaccination gets authorized, you privatize it and you give it all away. Ugh, you didn't bring anybody down, Ginny. That's a great story. We want to hear that your girlfriend's coming back. Like that's good news. That's not a downer at all. We want her to come back. Our company, Curative, a barely year-old California startup that's scaling testing across the country, was introduced to the state's pandemic response team on December 15th in an informal 3-sentence email from a senior advisor at Partners in Health. Days later, CIC Health, a newly formed company working with the state on testing, expressed interest in quarterbacking the Massachusetts vaccination effort. What? So you have a brand new startup coming in the middle of December and saying like, "Hey, we'll take care of this. We'll take care of getting rid of this vaccination." I know you've been working on this for 20 years or whatever, but we can handle this. We just started up last year. We're a startup. Within weeks, those two private entities, along with a third, were awarded no bid contracts to undertake perhaps one of the state's most pressing, ambitious initiatives in modern times. In issuing the contracts, the state sidestepped the planning infrastructure it built in response to the 9/11 terrorist attacks and the anthrax letter scare in 2001. The goal then? Prepare for an unseen major health catastrophe, which could require mass vaccinations. Here's a quote. We've been talking about this for 20 years. The state has invested in us. Dartmouth Public Sector Director Christopher Michaud said. They said they took the playbook, threw it in the dumpster, and privatized the whole thing. The blueprint laid out a regional approach for correlating the state's 351 local health departments in an emergency, and a recent updated status report on the playbook shows that the groups were equipped with detailed plans for how to open and operate vaccination sites. So they had their stuff together. They knew what was going to happen. They knew what they needed to do. And then all of a sudden, this upstart, Curative, which is not curative at all, good morning, G Wolf, just turns over the entire table. Massachusetts is hardly alone in using private contractors for some aspects of its COVID vaccine rollout. Virginia, for example, is one of more than 20 states using PrepMod, the same software vendor tapped by Massachusetts to help residents schedule vaccine appointments. But unlike Massachusetts, Virginia and a number of other states have kept outside contractors from operating vaccine clinics. They rely instead on local health departments and public workers. Yeah, that makes more sense. Like, why do you want to pay a contractor to come out and do the thing that you're already prepared to do? That sounds like a waste of resources. And also, you don't know that they know how to do it correctly when you've been planning this for 20 years. Governor Charlie Baker's administration has insisted the public health officials are playing a role in vaccinating the population. Some municipalities and healthcare facilities, for example, run a network of high-capacity regional clinics separate from the state's mass vaccination sites. Other local officials will be leaned on to vaccinate hard-to-reach populations, as the homebound who may, such as the homebound who may be unable or unwilling to visit a clinic. So, officials with the state's COVID command center declined an interview request, but released a statement saying that the state contracted with a number of vendors with experience to large-scale COVID-19 testing logistics and operations, as well as vaccination efforts that also had the bandwidth to swiftly scale up operations to meet the demands of this unprecedented effort. That's just word salad. The state is all in on its large-scale vaccination sites, which so far have pushed roughly 11% of doses administered across Massachusetts. That's not a ton. The number is sure to increase. Hospitals were the first to administer doses, many to their own staffers. So far this year, vaccination sites have been the third most trafficked location for doses. And these are old numbers. This is about a 2-week-old article. But I find it really interesting that they, again, these, startups, these contractors, these, private companies just have so much sway with the government. The term public-private partnership is just like taken and assumed as a good, when like there's this sort of assumption, and that kind of goes with neoliberalism, which is a word that I kind of struggle with using because it's so unclearly defined. So I try to define it as much as I can. Anyway, I define it as sort of like a increase in privatization. So basically, an increase of privatization of formerly public services. So things like energy, kind of like what happened in Texas, right? That's something that should be run as a public good, but it's run privately. And sort of the schools, for example, is another one. Those should be run publicly, but they've been rolled into private hands. They've been contracted out to private companies and corporations. And now what's happening with the vaccine? Everybody's get the vaccine. You can see very clearly, like by this article, that Massachusetts, in this particular case, was prepared to do broad scale distribution of the vaccine, but then they decided, just because we have this ideological predisposition, this assumed good that a private entity, a private drop it in Discord, Jenny, because I'll definitely read it. But anyway, there's this assumed sort of, it's taken as a given that something done privately is better and more efficient and just more desirable, just in a sort of more general sense, that you would choose to do that, have something privately run over having something be publicly run by the government. It's really, it's been the way that we've operated in the U.S. and broadly. Like the U.S. and the U.S. and England both really made this turn in probably about the 1970s. It would be very easy to peg Jimmy Carter, actually, and I've had discussions with this with other people. It would be easy to peg Jimmy Carter as the first neoliberal president, by which he sort of takes the emphasis off of public policy for what things are, for what is good for, the nation or in the US or whatever. And he sort of slides that narrative into essentially he slides it onto individuals, and that sort of opens up the door for this sort of neoliberal turn, which really got its hooks in with Reagan in the US, Thatcher in the UK, and both of those absolute ghouls, started busting unions. With Thatcher, like she busted unions with the miners out in the UK, amongst others, and that was sort of like the most famous one. And in the US, there was a huge air traffic controller strike in the US, and Reagan just fired them. So it was like a huge sort of like reorientation, a reprioritization of the what is good in a society, and workers took a back seat, corporations took got everything that they wanted, which is not particularly abnormal in the US. I mean, but I guess the period from round about the New Deal and through most of through even Nixon as president, there was a different relationship between the government and people. There was a lot more of an interest and an emphasis on creating a social safety net, some kind of a social democratic, not perfect by any stretch. It's not my vision of what the world should, the final form of the world should be. But it was definitely better than what we have now, which is just absolute, barbaric capitalism that right now in the middle of a pandemic, we don't even rent relief for people who have been, lost their jobs or just find themselves in a worse situation financially because of the pandemic. And myself, I've been kind of out of work since the pandemic started. I mean, it's been almost a year since I've been in the classroom. Anyway, sorry, rant over. I didn't see G-Wolf. You got your first shot on Friday. That's excellent. It was oddly easy. Which one did you get? Did you get Moderna? Did you get the AstraZeneca? I'm not the AstraZeneca, the Pfizer. Did you get the Johnson & Johnson? Did you get something we don't know about? Anyway. Speaking of, well, I wanted to see this, actually. So I actually don't know very much about what's going on in Bristol. Bristol, England. There's apparently some actions happening in the streets right there, and I would like to learn a little bit about it. So let's take a moment.
For 6 o'clock this morning, police vans are set on fire and officers suffer broken bones as a protest turns violent in Bristol.
A big clear-up is underway, as you can see, in Bristol this morning after a night of violent protest, a night where the police were the target.
Around 10,000 soldiers are expected to be cut from the army as part of the...
Right, well, hold on. There's like a whole last. Here we go.
2 police officers suffered broken bones and...
South in the east for the Redlands.
Come on now.
Good morning, it's Monday. It's the 22nd of March. Top story for you this morning is that 2 police officers suffered broken bones and police vans were set on fire when a protest in Bristol turned violent last night.
Thousands of people had gathered to demonstrate against the government's police and crime bill, which would give police more powers to restrict demonstrations. Our reporter Andrew Plant was there.
In a protest against new police powers, it was soon police themselves who became the target. Vans and a police car set on fire, fireworks thrown into the crowd, as around 1,000 protesters gathered in Bristol city centre in what has been, police say, the worst violence the city has seen in years. There's a row of police blocking off what is the central police station here in Bristol, but you can see at the end of the road, they've also blocked off now the end of this city centre street, but also the side roads too, and they're doing it from behind. But there's still about 1,000 people in here, And now
Mostly, I just see protesters dancing. I mean, that's. I mean, I saw a couple of people kicking windows, but there's a lot of people there.
being left with nowhere to go. Protesters here holding banners, concerned, they say, that the UK is becoming a police state. The Kill the Bill march started in the early afternoon, but as night fell, the clashes began. Projectiles thrown at officers in riot gear. We saw several people with head injuries being helped from the crowd.
I think it's horrible. And I agree with the cause of the protesters, but I think this is going to do anybody any good.
Several officers have been injured. The chair of the Avon and Somerset Police Federation said people's right to protest had been hijacked by protesters hell-bent on violence. Andrew Plant, BBC News in Bristol.
No, they love to talk about the radical extremists. I mean, like, there is some, somewhat scary imagery there, and the press is gonna like focus in on it, kind of salaciously. But I guess I don't know. It doesn't really seem like, I don't know. I need to know more about the bill. I mean, like, obviously, I don't know specifically what's going on the ground. I think the idea of a police bill that increases their sort of ability. Let's read this article. Or increases and expands the ability of cops to basically shut down peaceful protest is bad. So let's read. 7 people have been arrested so far in the Kill the Bill demonstrations in Bristol, which included protesters stoning a police station and setting fire to police vehicles. Annie Marsh said, that's just property, by the way. Annie Marsh said the force was hunting scores more people. The police are due to release the first images of suspects on Monday evening. Marsh took part in a conference call with the Home Secretary, Priti Patel, and the Metropolitan Police Commissioner, Cressida Dick, on Monday morning. We're all worried, he told The Guardian. We've been talked about our reflections on what happened in Bristol and what we need to do to reassure communities and keep our communities safe in Bristol across the country. Over the next few weeks, it's a very difficult time in policing. Oh, geez, it's so hard to be a cop. Marsh called the scenes criminality and thuggery, and said hundreds of or thousands. If anybody's got any information on what on a more complete picture of the protest, because right now, everything I see here is coming from cops. Bristol mayor, it's coming from the government or cops. The Home Secretary. I mean, geez. But I'm just sort of interested in what's going on here. Right wing's trying to ride the Trump wave, but the problem is the education system in the UK is historically better than the US. I mean, that's not saying much. It's the US education system right now is so. We talked about this on Friday. We watched the second thought video about it. It's a disaster because of the way that we've oriented our education system to be basically just geared towards testing. It's truly like a hollowed out, meaningless system in a lot of ways. I don't know who GOP rep Tom Reed is, but apparently he's under fire for sexual misconduct allegations. I don't know if I want to cover that. All right, Capitol riot. Let's do kids in cages. All right. Lawmakers press Biden administration to grant media access to border facilities. So let's take a look at this. So just to set up really quick, one of the things that Joe Biden ran on when he ran for president is that what? Police are opening fire on spring breakers? Oh, drop a story in Discord. I will definitely cover that. drop a story in Discord or because I will definitely take a look at that. That's insane. The bill will give the police. Okay, this is the England kill the bill, or the UK kill the bill. The bill will give police the authority to plant undercover policemen in clubs, restaurant, and streets at night. Don't they already do that? I'm pretty sure in the US they already do that, but still, if they don't have that right and they get that right, that's bad. I mean, cops are everywhere in the US. Good God. Texas spring break. Okay. All right. Yeah, let's do a quick change of gear. We'll cover kids in cages in a minute, but I definitely want to take a look at this. Miami Beach declares emergency. Cops fire tear gas at spring breakers. Oh my God. Officials in Miami Beach declared a state of emergency and instituted an 8 p.m. curfew after unruly, mostly maskless crowds of spring breakers descended on the city. This makes it sound like a horde of barbarians or something. When the crowd refused to disperse, officers appeared to fire pepper balls to force people off the streets. Is there video? Oh, there is video. Miami Beach Police Chief Richard Clement disputed the claim, telling Miami Herald that officers only used tear gas. It's fine. It's just tear gas. It's only tear gas. He said that while the crowds were defiant, their actions didn't reach the threshold that required to use pepper balls. It's just tear gas, not pepper balls. Come on, what do you think? We're monsters? I think the officers felt threatened at the time, Clement said. There's been an element there of either the crowd fighting or coming at officers. Authorities said that over 24 people were arrested on Saturday, March 21st night. Too many are coming really without the intention of following the rules. And the result has been a level of chaos and disorder that is just something more than we can endure. Oh, wow. Gelber said that the curfew will remain in effect until Tuesday. In addition to the curfew, the roads to Miami Beach from the mainland will be shut down to all non-local traffic starting at Jesus. It's like martial law in Texas. I mean, in Miami. Let's take a look at this here video.
Pepper balls were used to control the crowds on South Beach. This was after the curfew had passed and several roads were closed. Drastic measures were taken in tonight's spring break crackdown.
In fact, Miami Beach has declared a state of emergency, and we have team coverage tonight. Local 10's Ira Anwar has details about the roads that are shut down now.
But we start with Roy Ramos, who is showing us what happened when cops tried to clear the crowds. Roy.
Sanella and Laren, that curfew went into effect at 8 p.m. this evening, but despite us telling those spring breakers about it and law enforcement informing them of it, they still stuck around as if the rules did not apply to them. It is that action that prompted...
That's interesting framing, but go off.
Law enforcement out here to use force. In fact, you can still see them on Ocean Drive, making sure the remainder of people in this area leave. Pepper balls fired into the crowds of hundreds.
Oh, I thought they didn't use pepper balls. I thought they were just using tear gas.
Hundreds of spring breakers on South Beach after multiple attempts by police to disperse them. The mandatory curfew in the entertainment district put into effect at 8 Saturday night.
All right, so a lot of the imagery here is actually very terrifying to me. Like again, the spring breakers are obviously wrong for having like big parties and all this other stuff in the middle of a pandemic. Yes. At the same time, do we really think that the solution is to just like run them off the streets in these big tank looking vehicles, shooting tear gas and like pepper balls at them? Like, is that the solution to this? I don't know. It seems bad to me.
This is what things look like nearly an hour after people should have already cleared the area. We're standing right on 8th and Ocean, and take a look at these crowds. The problem here is that law enforcement now has to try and disperse these large crowds that have no intention of going anywhere.
Skip that curfew. We out here. We out here. No sleep, period.
The stubborn actions of many resulting in this. The latest curfew, along with business and road closures, announced just 4 hours earlier by city leaders who have seen gatherings like this escalate, become aggressive, and destructive.
At night, there is no question that it becomes a place that feels a little bit out of control or a lot out of control.
This cell phone video showing a restaurant with tables turned over and broken chairs. The group here dining without paying for their checks.
Oh no, they're skipping on checks.
Quite frankly, I'm concerned that the behavior is getting a little bit more for us to be able to handle.
The restrictions, city leaders say, is all in an effort to prevent crowds, stop crime and violence that the city says some spring breakers have brought to Miami Beach.
The bottom line is that a city has to protect its residents and its visitors.
Yeah, that's what I was about to say, G Wolf. Like the entire time, like Ron DeSantis, who was conspicuously absent from this video, basically denies that COVID exists, and basically is saying that his, handling of the situation, quote unquote, has been so good because he, opened up business and didn't do shit to mitigate it. But now in one of his cities, they're like literally shooting into crowds with pepper balls and tear gas. Like you want to have it both ways, dude. And I mean, like, this is serious from the perspective of like Ron DeSantis might run for president in 2021, like that kind of 2024 rather, that kind of thing.
Police and everybody.
And as we come back out live, that curfew is now being enforced here in the entertainment district, which includes Ocean, Collins, and Washington Avenues, and does expand north from 5th Street all the
wild. Just wild. I mean, like I said, like they have, yeah. That I think that what you're saying, G Wolf, is that is really kind of interesting too, because like when you've denied that COVID exists, basically as a governor, you're sending a signal that this is where you come. So you're essentially like saying to people, when you send this mixed message, that we don't believe COVID's real here. This is where you come to have fun. So when people go there to have fun, they get shot up in a crowd. So it's just a nightmare. Oh, it's a nightmare. Oh my God. Here is something else that I wanted to talk about. Any injuries? I saw that they had, well, I didn't see anything in the report. I can open it back up and look, but it doesn't look like it. They looked like there was some arrests though, huh? No question, blah, 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 blah. I don't see anything about arrests or any injuries. That doesn't mean there aren't any. I mean, getting, tear gas and pepper ball shot at you is like, that's assault. But I haven't seen anything about particular injuries. Pretty terrible reporting on that part, actually. Huh. All right, the Biden administration, kids in cages. So I don't want to one of the things that the Biden administration ran on was that there would be no more kids in cages, that, it would completely change the way that we do immigration, et cetera. I mean, not fundamentally change, obviously nothing will fundamentally change, but there would be a difference in how the Biden administration handled the situation where, you know, people are trying to leave countries that have been largely displaced and impacted by U.S. foreign policy. I'm talking about coups in Honduras, attempted coups in places like Bolivia, or, you know, even temporarily successful coups that get flipped back, and all throughout the you know, Central and South America. They're coming to the United States for an opportunity to, you know, start a new life, to escape from oppression, as to running for their lives in a lot of situations. These people are refugees. And considering that the Biden administration sort of sent a signal that would be easier on immigration, or at least easier on immigrants as they came in, specifically that they would not have children in cages and they wouldn't separate families, which I don't believe they're separating families, to be accurate. If I'm wrong on that, check me. But some children are coming across the border by themselves, without their families, and they're being rounded up by the border cops and thrown into these detention centers. Now, is that a functional difference? Maybe a little bit, but it's not good, and it's not what anybody expected or hoped would happen out of this. And the Biden administration has been extremely sloppy. They could very easily be sending these kids to their families. But right now, it seems like press wants to get, or at least lawmakers want to give press access to these facilities. So let's take a look.
Authorities are expelling the majority of top U.S. immigration officials said today that authorities are expelling the majority of migrants crossing the southern border, but unaccompanied children are not expelled. The migrant surge is a growing political crisis for the Biden administration. We get more now from CBS's Christina Ruffini at the White House. Christina, good evening.
Good evening. The White House has tried to avoid calling what's happening at the border a crisis, but it is a big problem, with the number of encounters on track to be the greatest in 20 years.
Hundreds of unaccompanied migrant children are showing up each day at the southern border, but President Biden says he won't send them back.
What do you do with an unaccompanied child that comes to the border? Do you repeat what Trump did? We're not doing that.
His administration's compassionate approach to immigration policy has been confused for leniency, and a record 15,000 migrant children are now in U.S. custody.
The message is quite clear: do not come. The border is closed.
This guy right here, Mayorkas, is like literally trying to say, he's doing like the closed border, like isolationist thing, and this is the Biden administration. Like I said before, this is the Biden administration saying this.
Is closed. The border is closed.
Appearing on multiple Sunday shows, Department of Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas defended the administration's border policy, blaming the rocky transition period and the actions of President Trump.
President Trump,
you know, that's the thing that Democrats always do. When they sort of slide in, and I mean, this happened with like the Iraq War and the Afghanistan War too. Oh, the previous administration put us in this position where we have to do these awful things, and the sort of like assumed understanding is that we can't make these things any better. Yeah, exactly, Antifa. Most of the refugees are fleeing from what we installed, what the U.S. has done. Yeah, they're purposely not separating families, which is good. And what's happening, G. Wolf, is that essentially, you know, parents are sending their kids unaccompanied, with the hopes that the kids would be sent to, you know, family members that are already in the U.S., but instead they're being detained. Americans really need to realize that those people are refugees. Yeah, absolutely, and know that they're coming from the most racist, from the racist country in the world that despises them, and that there should be an indication of how desperate they are. Yeah, they're running for their lives. They're 100% refugees.
Dismantled the orderly, humane, and efficient way of allowing children to make their
Orderly,
claims under
humane, and efficient way.
United States
Hold
law.
on. Let's go back.
of
and the actions of President Trump.
President Trump dismantled the orderly, humane, and efficient way of allowing children to make their claims under United States law in their home countries.
But Republicans
Wait, what? What is he saying?
say the border is
of allowing children to orderly, humane,
and the actions of President Trump.
President Trump dismantled the orderly, humane, and efficient way of allowing children to make their claims under United States law in their home countries.
But Republicans
You
say
mean
the
like
border
deporting
is
the
now
children? Is that what you want to do? Most of the refugees are coming specifically from Honduras because of the 2009 Hillary and Obama installed fascist regime that basically runs organized crime from top of the street there. Yeah, I mean, you've actually been posting about this in Discord, a couple of articles. We don't have time to get to those specifically today. But yeah, there is a lot of stuff going on with that. There was also this pretty ridiculous picture of Kamala Harris just hanging out with Border Patrol, which is just like yikes, big yikes. Do we have time? No, we don't have time. I was gonna say we could run that Renegade cut video, but I don't know if we have time. We only have 9 minutes. But Andrew's starting late today. You know what? Let's run the video. Let's do it. Let's do it. Here's a video from Renegade Cut. We could just sort of react to it. Borders are violent. All right, come on.
In this moment, how many people right now in this moment are currently displaced, seeking refuge in another land, seeking employment in another land due to lack of options in their own, seeking asylum from dangerous conditions, or seeking a better life for their families after the resources of their home had been stolen by wealthy entities? In total, there are about 1 billion migrants throughout the world. Of this billion, there are 80 million who are forcibly displaced, including 45.7 million people who are internally displaced within their own countries. Of these displaced people, approximately 45% are under the age of 18. If the world population is approximately 7 billion, then 1 out of every 7 human beings on Earth is presently a migrant. For context, there are more migrants on Earth than the populations of the United States, Canada, Germany, the United Kingdom, France, Italy, and Japan combined.
Holy crap.
Migrants is a broad classification for people who are living and working outside of their nation of origin. This can include everything from migrant laborers seeking either temporary or permanent employment if there is little to none in their home, to refugees from war, famine, changing climate, cartels, and other disastrous, dangerous conditions. Migration generally flows from poor nations to richer nations, often prompting a nativist and xenophobic posture from the citizens of.
Can somebody check with why I'm blocked by Renegade Renegade Cut on Twitter? I don't know this person. I've never interacted with them, but I'm blocked. Can somebody, I don't know, somebody who's not blocked figure that out?
Of the rich nations. However, many of the conditions that lead to migration from poor nations to rich nations have to do with circumstances created by the rich nations in the first place. Unequal trade deals, debt from the former colonial period, wars waged by rich nations on poor nations, environmental disasters attributed to climate change primarily caused by industry in rich nations, and other circumstances that lead to people abandoning their homes in search of a better life. In other words, rich nations exploit poor nations and create conditions in which those living in poor nations need to seek refuge elsewhere. Then, rich nations set the terms in which poor migrants and refugees can enter, effectively laying responsibility on the people of the poor nations for circumstances created by the rich nations. Finally, rich nations do not accept responsibility for the conditions that lead to migration and use nativist political propaganda, news media, and other forms of manufactured resentment to maintain this relationship and this system. According to philosophers such as Jean Bodin and sociologists like Max Weber, a state is a territory in which a monopoly of violence has been claimed. Violence is physical force, physical control, or a threat of either. We, as residents of the state, are not permitted access to violence. whereas agents of the state, be they politicians or law enforcement, either control the terms in which violence can be used or perform the violence directly. The border of a state is used to physically enforce the terms of who is and is not allowed within the state. Thus, a border is not only potentially violent in the more visual, explicit, and instantly recognizable form of this definition. Instead, a border itself is a form of violence. This is compounded by the fact that
this is kind of I don't know, like part of the reason I wanted to watch this because I'm not exactly sure that I agree with like every word. I mean, like literally, borders are maintained through violence, and like nationalism is violence to an extent that you're distinguishing between one group of people and another. So I guess borders are violence, but I do want to sort of like in the broad sense. But I'm really kind of interested in the specifics.
activities decided within the state that affect.
There's one Renegade Cuts Better videos. They really hit the mark on calling out neoliberal rentierism. Here exactly, extractive hegemony is it's coup d'etat. Okay. I never heard of Renegade. I mean, I've seen a couple of their videos. I don't know why I'm blocked by them on Twitter though.
People outside the state through foreign policy.
I don't think I've been mean to them on Twitter. I'm a pretty nice boy.
And other public figures direct our attention to violence at the borders to justify this resentment. But the existence of borders is a far greater source of violence.
Just cutting that beach in half.
National borders partition the world and control
also
migration.
Very cool. Somebody's doing donuts in their truck on the beach. That's dope.
To serve the economic interests of the few. How did this happen? Was it always this way? And if not, does that mean that some other system, some other way of life can work out better for all of us? Precisely how humankind transformed from nomadic to sedentary life is speculated and debated among anthropologists, but some matters are clear enough.
Like the stream,
Sedentary
folks.
agriculture
Like the stream.
began around 10,000 BCE, which eventually led to early states around 3000 BCE in Egypt and Mesopotamia. These early states had no boundaries or clear territory. Although scholars debate the finer points, one theory of state development
I know,
is
it's
that
very,
the early
like,
states were created to protect
mellow.
the private property of the few, as agriculture led to early stratified economic classes. It was not human nature that created inequality if states did not develop for thousands of years. Rather, it was circumstance and environment. According to Rhys Jones, author of Violent Borders, modern histories of states emphasize the positive attributes of state expansion. The positive version of state expansion ignores the significant role of coercion in state making. States extracted taxes that were used to pay for armies, administration, and large building projects. States were also incubators for disease, with a dense population, monoculture crops, and the pests that follow. Most states practiced slavery and relied on forced labor and military conscription for
You know, a little bit of this language is interesting too. Like, modern history of states emphasize the positive attributes of state expansion. The positive version of state expansion ignores significant role of coercion in state making. So I'm kind of like this is almost like an anarchish read in my opinion. Like the idea of because it goes on to say states extracted taxes that were used to pay for armies. Like it's almost like saying that taxes are bad. I mean, like obviously the armies are bad, but administration of a state is good. Large building projects are good. So like it's not. I think an assumption kind of couched in what's being said here is a little bit like it's something that I'm not like totally 100% with. Not necessarily even like anarchic. I mean but like more like libertarian. Like just saying that the taxes. I could see a libertarian rolling that out.
Territorial expansion. States emerged by enclosing land and resources and by limiting the movement of other people. This enclosure was performed by those who gained and inherited enough power to do so. This continued throughout the centuries. In 16th century Europe, During the emergence of capitalism, lords began to enclose common land and convert it into territory and private property. In short, over the course of human history, greater wealth was accumulated and concentrated among the few,
Yeah, it's
and
unquestionable.
greater restrictions on movement and land were established to maintain that wealth and prevent the masses from having control of their own lives. Also in the 16th century, Europe was still recovering from the Black Plague. Massive population loss stunted development of the continent by annihilating their labor force and weakening their institutions. However, some European nations still maintained their militaries and sought to rebuild through colonization and exploitation of more vulnerable nations. Much in the way that Europe suffered from depopulation in the 14th and 15th centuries, Africa, North America, and South America were depopulated by European conquerors in the 16th century through the 19th century, through slavery, executions, warfare, and
It's
control from
colonialism.
afar, all in the service of stripping resources. Colonialism is a policy of conquering, stealing, and controlling a new territory, transforming indigenous populations into second-class citizens or slaves. This eventually enriched much of Europe. Inexpensive labor or slave labor throughout the history of colonialism in the Americas and Africa provided the capital for the Industrial Revolution in Europe and eventually the United States. This allowed richer nations to develop and modernize by the 19th century and prevented poor nations from doing the same for a long time. According to Teresa Hayter, author of Open Borders, The Case Against Immigration Controls, the wealth of Europe and other industrialized countries was built from the 16th century onwards through the exploitation of the natural resources and peoples of the rest of the world. Europeans used the labor of conquered peoples to produce raw materials and primary products for consumption in Europe, and they destroyed the industries of the more advanced civilizations they encountered in their imperial expansion. They
I mean,
then
they did that especially all over Africa and North America. They would, I mean, many of the sort of like Aztec, Inca, Maya tribes, some of the other more specific, like, to like, like the modern day United States, um, Iroquois and many of those were completely and utterly just completely destroyed over the years. I mean, through different periods, of course, not like all at once. Do libertarians still exist? Yes, they're everywhere. They are a plague upon this planet, and I hate them.
embarked on their own industrialization and they protected their new industries through quotas, tariffs, and prohibitions. Once they had established their dominance, they advocated free trade. Following the end of the colonization
Yeah,
period,
yeah.
and
Once you've already got like once you've got all of the of everything sort of like squared away, and you're in a hugely advantageous position, and you say, "Oh yeah, let's do free trade.
equal relationship between rich nations and poor
Let's trade like everybody's equal." Yeah, totally.
nations had been established through trade deals that disadvantaged the latter. This unequal relationship was also solidified through debt from colonization that poor nations had to pay off themselves, despite being debts created and enforced by the colonizers. These debts give rich nations the power to impose policies on poor nations, such as monopolies by foreign corporations, and influence on internal policy that advantages the rich nations. This unequal economic relationship works in tandem with stricter immigration restrictions and tightened security at borders. Once rich nations could control poor nations through economics, rich nations then had to find a way to prevent migrants and refugees from simply abandoning their annihilated homeland and living, ironically, in the nation that was responsible. Restrictions on entering nations, particularly rich nations, rose in tandem with trade deals that negatively affected poor nations. According to Harsha Walia, author of Undoing Border Imperialism, a salient example of the impact of capitalist mobility on migration trends in North America is the effects of the 1994 North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, which has displaced millions of Mexicans, and the parallel fortification of the US-Mexican border against migrants. Under NAFTA,
You say that that libertarians' vision of how things is really weak and easily refuted, and like on a like logical basis or any kind of material basis, that's true. But those are some stubborn motherfuckers, man. Like they just don't ever back down.
Mexican government was forced to eliminate subsidies to corn while corn produced in the United
Ants and
States
black
remained
flags is very
subsidized,
leftist.
thus making U.S. corn cheaper to buy inside Mexico than
I
Mexican.
don't know. Ants have class society though. They have a queen that's a little bit too royal for me. They have, you know, an entire class of like male drones, which is not cool. And then they have the workers. And what needs to happen in an ant society is that the ants, worker ants, need to take over, and overthrow the queen. And the NAFTA stole the commons from campesinos, which forced them to emigrate. Yeah, exactly. And it also lowered the standard for American workers to the point where you can send industry, you know, anywhere across the world, which I mean, eventually needed to happen. However, it happened in such a way that was so quick that it dropped the floor out of the bottom of the U.S. economy. So it was essentially like forced globalization, which I'm not against globalization, but it was globalization in the interest of capital.
Corn. As a result, over 15 million Mexicans were forced into poverty, and 1.5 million farmers who lost their farms migrated to the United States to work in low-wage sectors. The maintenance of poverty by rich nations
Oh, it's just the
forces
it's just the
migrants
worker
and poor
ants. I got
nations
you.
to travel to the very nations that kept them in poverty. Migrant laborers suffer from abuse and exploitation. This includes criminally low wages and dangerous occupations. Because of their tenuous legal status, migrant laborers are unlikely to raise serious grievances with their employers, or they may face dismissal or even deportation. In summary, rich nations keep some nations in relative poverty through unequal trade deals and debt arrangements.
Yeah, I mean, like again, the whole point of so the problem with um you know, NAFTA, for example, isn't that it's doing, you know, internet. It's not the fact that it's an international trade deal isn't the problem. The problem is that it doesn't increase the standards for workers in America or Mexico or Canada or anywhere. It lowers them. The problem with the USMCA, the current new NAFTA, is the same problem. The problem with the TPP was that it literally lowered work standards, and it made it took power away from states and gave it to corporations. That's the problem. We need to cut out the billionaire and the commodified financialized rentier capitalism. I mean, like just all capital. It's just capitalism. That's what it is. I find labels very troublesome because it distracts from actual discussion. Yeah, I think at some point, I mean, I agree to a degree with that, Jenny. I think that labels are necessary, not necessarily in the point of like calling somebody a this or a that is particularly important. I think it helps in terms of like grouping people in your mind in different sets. Like I don't really clearly identify myself specifically as like a Marxist, leftist, socialist, communist, anarcho, whatever. Like mostly because I like to lead with my ideas and let people sort of like group me based off of that. And if anybody wants to like I think that's a really important question or a really important dynamic. Like I don't get very precious about the labels that are applied to me, I guess, unless it's like if like somebody said I was like anti-worker or whatever, if I was anti like you know, anti-union, I would take some exception because that's like necessarily untrue. But a lot of the other specific stuff I'm not too interested on. Absolutely right. The problem is accumulated wealth at the top, which is ultimately has created a feudal hierarchy. Yeah, I mean, it's I don't know about feudal. Feudal is a little bit different from the perspective of there's actual classes of workers, like in a lot more clear of a way, and a lot more of an ensconced in like ensconced in like it was a lot more concrete, I suppose. Not as concrete as you might think about it, but it was like a very clear network of patronage. Now there's a lot more sort of like assumed personal responsibility on each individual, which like with the idea of homo economicus or whatever, like the assumption that people will make good decisions or at least decisions in their interests means that if you don't make those decisions in your interests, that there's some kind of a moral problem with you, as opposed to a sort of like assumed um sort of destiny or whatever based off of how you were born. Now, it sort of like takes that reality away and replaces it with a different like morality, I suppose. But I mean, the material power dynamics and circumstances are not that different. If that makes any sense. That might have been a ramble.
Then rich nations welcome some migrants from poor nations to exploit them for inexpensive labor. Rich nations also exclude most migrants.
You know, and like I don't run away from labels either, to be really clear about that, which I don't run away from labels, but I don't run towards labels. Like if somebody wants to call me something, I'm like, oh sure, whatever. I don't think about it that much. I'm more interested in the ideas.
To maintain control of the
and not like in the
economy
Dave
and to
Rubin ideas way. I like my brain is still in recovery mode, but like I actually like I'm interested in talking about the things that matter. Not so much like, oh, I'm not talking to you because you're a tanky or whatever. Now, getting into that sort of specific set of ideas, there's parts of like people who call themselves those things that I agree with. There are parts that I really, really disagree with. But like again, throwing that in there is really difficult. You're right. We just have to be very precise with our labels if we're going to use them. I agree with you all. Yeah. Label can be very important, especially in academic setting, but they're not as important as ideas. They're really, really difficult when you're doing organizing too. Like if you are trying to organize around, like, for example, a union drive, and you basically, I mean, like understanding where people are at is good, but like understanding what you have in common is more important than understanding how people are different. I guess my sort of kumbaya-ish analysis.
Force most in poor nations to continue to provide inexpensive goods to import
Thank you.
into their nations. On its face, this is obviously inhumane, but propaganda changes the narrative from a conflict between rich nations and poor nations to a conflict between what is legal and what is illegal. It is legal to impose restrictions on borders. It is legal to maintain poverty in poor nations through trade and debt. It is illegal to flee from these conditions and immediately join the workforce of a wealthy nation. Rich nations make the rules to disadvantage poor nations and then chastise poor nations and poor migrants for not following them. No matter how little power migrants have, and no matter how badly they are treated, the blame is always shifted on them instead of those who have created these conditions in the first place. Legal immigration good, illegal immigration bad. However, the legal immigration system is prohibitively costly and time-consuming for those facing immediate harm.
This is a perfect point, actually. Like the idea that people should like immigrate the quote unquote right way. Like, you don't think people would do that if they had the option to? The problem is the way that you do it. The rules are stifling. It hugely benefits, or it's hugely tilted rather in the in favor of people who already have resources, and it's even framed a lot of times from this perspective of, we want to bring in the good ones that are going to add to our economy. We don't want to bring in the bad ones that are going to take away from it. It's a completely like respectability based argument around it, and the society and the sort of like policy reflects that.
Legal immigration good,
Totally
illegal
unexpected
immigration
Tucker.
bad.
A wild Tucker appears.
However, the legal immigration system is prohibitively costly and time-consuming for those facing immediate hardship. Legal immigration often takes years, work visas have many restrictions,
Yeah, they
and
do. State
application
Department
is
talking
no
points.
guarantee of entry, ever. The legal immigration apparatus in a rich nation like the United States is a maze of caps on nations and limitations on who may and may not cross the border. If the legal option is not available, the illegal option will be taken. If the legal
That is
option
exactly
is not
right.
immediate, but the need is immediate, the illegal option will be taken. It is simply inhumane to expect people whose lives have been destroyed by poverty to wait for years, sometimes decades, before trying to make a better life for themselves and their families. It is a position of incredible privilege and hypocrisy, considering why they are impoverished to begin with.
I wouldn't even necessarily like just say hypocrisy. Like it's dangerous criminalization. Like if I don't want to put like if you don't want to put a moral or a moral assignation to it, fine. You're actually making like lives for not just the people that you're doing here. You're making that worse, and you're also making it worse for yourself. Because when you and from a labor perspective, again, when you have classes of workers, and this is kind of the critical thing, and I've had multiple conversations with people about this. When you have a class of workers who have no rights based off of the fact that they're not legally allowed to even be there, but they still need to work for a living, they're in a much, much, much more vulnerable position to be exploited by their bosses and by the state. So take that for what you will.
Those who leave the borders of their own nation due to emergency hardships and displacement rather than purely to seek employment are more commonly called refugees. Civilians in nations that are suffering from a bombing campaign from a richer nation with economic interests in the region often find themselves without homes. This can happen directly, meaning their physical house or building can be destroyed in the conflict, or indirectly due to the nation's
Sorry to keep like harping on this, but like I'm kind of like feeling a brainwave. So like when you have the class of workers who have less, who basically have no rights, that drives down all working conditions for all of those workers as well, because bosses are going to try to hire the people that don't have status, the people that have no rights, because they can pay them less, and because they don't have to pay like workman's comp. They just have to do it under the table, right? And what ends up happening there is that means that there's less of a dependence on or there's less work. So essentially bosses are going to hire people who don't have those rights. They're going to hire the people that they can pay less. So immigration is a labor issue fundamentally.
Loss of infrastructure and institutions. Refugees count in the millions, and these various refugee crises originating in poor nations can be directly tied to the intervention of rich nations. For example, the United States' involvement in Afghanistan from 2001 until today. More than 2.5 million people are estimated to be living in a prolonged internal displacement, while more than 2.7 million people have been forced to leave the nation to live in Iran, Pakistan, or various nations in Europe. As of last year, 9.2 million Iraqis are either internally displaced or refugees abroad. Internal displacement means that people are resettled within the same nation but live in camps and temporary housing indefinitely, partly due to limits on rich nations accepting refugees. In addition to war refugees, there are also climate refugees, people displaced due to changing environment or environmental disasters. According to the United Nations Refugee Agency, the impacts of climate change are numerous, limited.
And Ben Shapiro would tell them to sell their house and move or whatever, like to who?
Natural resources such as drinking water are likely to become even scarcer in many parts of the world. Crops and livestock struggle to survive in climate change hotspots, where conditions become too hot and dry or too cold and wet, threatening livelihoods and exacerbating food insecurity. People are trying to adapt to the changing environment, but many are being forcibly displaced from their homes by the effects of climate change and disasters, or are relocating in order to survive. What the UN does not say, however, is that climate change is primarily caused by rich nations. Remember those 7 nations from the beginning? That's the G7, a collective of nations that constitute 58% of the world's net wealth. Not surprisingly, among the top 20 contributors to
We're
climate
number
change, all 7
2.
of these nations are within the top 20, not to mention other heavily industrialized nations like China, Russia, Australia, and others. With the exception of Brazil, there are
We're sending we're sending poor and middle class kids to school to wars that quote no one understands. No, it's just boondoggle after boondoggle because I mean the function of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars has long since like it's no longer about the resources in the region or maintaining any kind of stability. It's basically used as a whip to keep to use sort of like patriotic mechanisms, like patriotic hegemony, to say like we need to support the troops, we need to support the America or whatever. It's basically just like a very sort of impotent dying gasp of nationalism in the US, which is sort of being really quickly subsumed by it's being leveraged, but it's also being replaced by corporate hegemony very, very quickly. Like nationalism is sort of on the decline in the US, but it's on the decline, but it's also like sort of paradoxically like super ramped up because it's being exploited by the corporations to divide working class people.
There are no South American nations on this list.
Like
Africa,
like nationalism in the US is under the control of sort of the corporate America, and sort of the way that things have been framed has essentially been like culture war, and that's what the politics has largely become. And when you take off questions of material gain or material needs of like working class people, like the Democrats constantly do, when you have things like the $15 minimum wage, take that off the table, what do you have left? Culture war.
contributes relatively little to
That's why you see so many Republicans putting these anti-trans bills on state legislatures. One, because they hate trans people, of course, but two, they know that if they attack, like if they put the grounds of fighting in the grounds of like what's up for debate, as far as like targeting minority communities in the U.S., you have to defend that. You cannot just like let anti-trans bills pass through state legislatures or any kind of federal stuff. It's like you can't do that. That's just like you can't abandon any group of comrades in the working class in the struggle.
climate change. The rich nations of the world, however, destroy the climate and create millions of climate refugees. Due to the changing climate, some estimate that there will be between 150 and 200 million climate change refugees by the year 2050. Rich nations only take a fraction of these refugees in total. Many refugees are turned away from all nations, either indefinitely seeking a home or indefinitely displaced internally in the aforementioned camps. The refugees are not simply divided up among all the nations. Many of them are simply trapped. Furthermore, the numbers don't add up in any meaningful way to justify the actions of the rich nations. For example, the United States sets refugee admission caps. According to Pew Research, in 2019, the administration set a refugee ceiling of only 30,000, and in 2020, the ceiling was set to only 18,000. This might sound like a lot of people, but not when you take into account
That is
that there are
18,000 people out of 80 million. That's like, I mean, again, you don't expect 0.02% of the worldwide population. Yeah, you don't expect the US to like do the entire worldwide population, but this is the place that people are going to come in a lot of senses. And if you cap it that low, oh my God, you're just not doing any level of immigration at all. Period.
Are 80 million refugees worldwide. 18,000 is 0.02% of 80 million, a fraction of a percent. Defenders of rich nations might also argue that the very richest nations are still leading the way in taking in these refugees, but that is not actually true either. Of the G7, only Germany is among the top 5 host nations for refugees, below Pakistan and Uganda.
That's really interesting because like Turkey's number one, and Turkey's having huge nationalism problems right now.
Only Germany is among the top 5 host nations for refugees, below Pakistan and Uganda. No matter how desperate the refugees are, and no matter how responsible the rich nations are for their circumstances and hardships, many of the citizens of the rich nations will still buy into the idea that refugees are
18K is about a small basketball stadium.
troublemakers at best and dangerous criminals at worst. Politicians demonize immigrants, and the press, particularly the conservative press, uncritically repeats their accusations or uses the controversy to their own benefit. Again, from Open Borders. The criminalization of refugees and migrants has the effect, deliberately or otherwise, of creating a group of people who are subject to extreme forms of exploitation as illegal workers. It also feeds racist prejudice. The government uses language about refugees which differs little from that of the gutter press. It is then a small step, encouraged at
This is
times
what
by
we were
the
talking about
selective
earlier
release of crime
about how we talk
statistics
about
and the result
refugees.
of government investigations into international crime rings to accuse asylum seekers of cheating on Social Security, scavenging tube tickets, and other rackets. So, with all of this in mind, about borders and refugees and immigrants, does the world have to be this way?
I mean, you can just say that. Just say no. You
It
just
was
say
not
no.
always this way.
It doesn't have to
In
be.
the United States, for example, between 1892 and 1954, almost 12 million immigrants were processed through the immigration station on Ellis Island. It was a golden era of immigration, people coming from all over the world to start again in the United States, and the nation largely benefited from this mass of immigrants. However, between these years, the number of annual immigrants reduced every time anti-immigration legislation was passed.
Yeah, it's really
Quotas were
bad.
created, entire nations and regions were restricted or outright banned. Ellis Island is now a museum. Everything has changed. So, how do we solve the border crisis? Well, there are two lines of thinking. One is solving the circumstances that lead to undocumented migrant labor and refugees in the first place, and the second is solving borders as violence specifically by abolishing immigration restrictions. In truth, both solutions must occur in tandem. The abolition of restrictions and the reorganization of the entire world cannot happen through one reform or one change. Interventionist wars of choice must end, or else war refugees will always exist. Greater steps towards curtailing climate change must also be enacted. Climate scientists have their recommendations, and for reasons of the profit motive, they are not always followed. All trade deals must be immediately renegotiated to be more equitable. All colonial debt must be immediately wiped out. The ratio of aid going into poor nations must be made higher than what is extracted. Believe it or not, for all the talk of rich nations providing foreign aid, that is currently not the case. They take more than they give. We can't just keep building bigger and bigger walls. They don't work, and they don't actually solve inhumane conditions.
No, they don't work, but they're symbolic for like creating this notion of Fortress America. Like the whole point of the wall wasn't to actually keep people out. Most people get to here flying through, through airports. Obviously, there are people who do attempt to get through the border, like directly in this way. But primarily, this is a symbol saying America is closed. So when that Mayorkas guy, the head of DHS, says the border is closed, he's using wall language, and there's a wall there. So, yeah.
Conditions. They only keep inhumane conditions out of sight. Now, what about the borders themselves? Borders tear families apart, separating children from their parents, sometimes permanently. Borders force migrants and refugees into the hands of unscrupulous or outright criminal agents, subjecting them to long periods of arbitrary detention, hunger, isolation, racial harassment, and in some cases, forced medical procedures. The crowding of migrants in camps often leads to disease and epidemics. Even those who are eventually released suffer trauma from the experience. This is particularly true of children. The common counterargument to all of this is invariably, well, if they don't want to be tortured and have their children stolen from them, they shouldn't have come here. But this argument falls apart under scrutiny. Besides who is at fault for creating the circumstances in the first place, there is no moral justification for violating the human rights of others and no legal justification for the frequent violations of international law that are ignored at borders. Thus, the whole "it's your fault for crossing the border" argument and the related "it's not our problem" argument absolutely crumble when a broader view of events is allowed. It is unreasonable to expect someone to continue living in their home if it's on fire. Another argument against abolition of restrictions is that existing jobs would be threatened and that immigrants are a tremendous strain on welfare. However, studies consistently show that is not true. Economic migration is only perpetuated because there is economic demand across the border. A counterargument to this is that these circumstances may change if, say, only the United States loosens or abolishes its border restrictions. But if this action is done in tandem with other rich nations like the rest of the G7 or some European Union members, the influx of migrants would not land solely on the borders of the US. Other arguments against abolishing immigration restrictions come from irrational fear. Politicians and conservative pundits beat the drum of nativism, claiming that migrants and refugees are dangerous. This has been especially common in the United States and the United Kingdom in recent
Marjorie
years.
Taylor Greene. Good
However,
Lord.
studies have shown that immigrants are less likely to commit crimes than those born in the US. Nativist sentiment also includes the charge that allowing more immigrants would change the culture of the nation, but this is merely a dog whistle for race. A nakedly bigoted argument is inherently worthless. So, what would a world with limited or no immigration restrictions even look like? Those in favor of this abolition vary in their overall political philosophies, meaning whether or not their end goal is the abolition of the state and borders altogether. But a common proposal, one which could be arranged within our current system, is this. Immigrants, whether migrant workers or refugees, would pass through customs checkpoints, and migration would no longer be prevented by Border Patrol. Illegal immigration would be a label only for unwelcome terrorists, those carrying contraband, and others deemed to be planning immediate harm. Few would be turned away except under these extreme circumstances uncovered during screening. All other migrants and refugees would be given immigration documents. No caps that would limit the amount of migrants, no waiting for years for the system to choose your turn, no arbitrary denials based on education, skills, or status of family across the border. Nothing like that. With practically no immigration restrictions and with almost everyone getting documented, there would be no need for dangerous coyote crossings or climbing over walls. Migrants risk their lives because they assume, often correctly, that they will be turned away at the border. If they are no longer turned away, the coyote crossings would dry up, leaving what remains of Border Patrol to focus on actual problems. That is not to say that abolition of immigration restrictions would have no problems, only that this system would produce fewer problems and would be significantly more humane. This is not some utopian dream, because the world used to be this way, and it can be this way again.
That was pretty good. I mean, there are different questions about like what the definition of borders are. I think that the one that Renegade Cut laid out, being sort of like the political definition, like is necessarily violence. I mean, that's sort of like the point of them, is that they're the extent of a nation, and they're enforced as such through the barrel of a gun. Now there's difference in terms of like cultural borders and things like that. But yeah. All right. So I just posted the link to the Discord. Y'all should jump in there. You should definitely like this stream and subscribe to Good Morning Comrade here. Borders are silly. Most people say stay where they are born and never go anywhere. They do that only if things don't get worse. If things get worse, people leave. But yeah, like the stream. You can support us on patreon.com/goodmorningcomrade. And you can follow me on Twitter at twitter.com/eminentprof. And all right, I'm going to go ahead and jump us over to Andrea She started a little bit late today. That's why I went a little bit over her usual time. So there she is. Go check it out. Most of y'all are probably headed there already. Thanks everybody for joining us. This was good. I kind of like hanging out, watching videos, and chatting with y'all about it. Maybe we should do a little bit more of that. Unless America brings freedom to their country. Right, that's true. that would qualify as things getting worse, G-Wolf. Just to be 100% clear on that. That would qualify as things getting wolf. Bye, Antifa. Thanks everybody for chatting. Definitely. Love it. All right, I'm gonna go. Bye-bye.